you don't know me, my name's Mark Gilroy. I'm the Managing Director of TMSDI. I've been here with the company for the last 15 years, and my background's in psychology. And many of you, if we have met, we probably will have met on one of the accreditation programs, or perhaps at one of our network forums. My passion, which feeds into the business that we're in, is around making the best out of every single conversation that takes place through leveraging insights, understanding and appreciating diversity at work, and doing that through a whole range of our psychometric tools. And we're going to be looking at one of those tools in particular today as part of the piece of the puzzle in the story that Phil's about to tell. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to our special guest, Phil. Now, Phil and I met, we were just talking about over 4 years ago, at an event called Connecting HR Leads, and have stayed in touch and become firm friends ever since. He's become an accredited practitioner of some of the TMS tools, and I've been interested to see him on his own journey as well into running his own business. So welcome, Phil.
Thank you, Mark. I'm delighted to be here this afternoon and to be sharing with yourselves the story of a leadership team in crisis. Just a little bit of background about that. This is about a leadership team in a medium-sized engineering business that's long established, but has suffered years of crises with executives being removed from the business, and the survivors plus some new recruits were the ones that I would be seeing. I was engaged to bring an external perspective on this senior team and the prevailing business culture. There was also a bit of baggage as well from previous initiatives on leadership and culture that had not really made any lasting impact. So it was against that background that I was brought in.
And then just looking at some of the individuals we have joining us today, Phil, quite a few of them are coming from very similar perspectives of working with these types of teams, and in particular leadership teams, and looking for some insights there. So of course we'll be sharing your story so far, some of the approaches you've taken, but equally back to our participants on this session, if you have any insights, if you have any thoughts, questions, comments about anything that's covered here, maybe even if you're happy sharing some of the details of the teams that you're currently working with, please feel free to get involved, join that conversation, and just let us know in the chat box.
Yeah, absolutely. So, just a little bit about knowing me better. You can find me on social media at Fulford Phil or at Blue Tree Phil, and I'm a fellow of the CIPD and have ILM qualifications that you can see on the screen. I've got a background in HR of more than 20 years, and I've now been running my own leadership, people and culture consultancy for the past 2 years. The other pictures there, just to share a little bit of flavour of me, show Mark and Kerry and Mel at one of our Connecting HR York Christmas events, because Mark and I, as part of our friendship, co-founded that group with Kerry, and we're shortly to be celebrating our 3rd birthday. I'm also sat in Aguero's seat in the Man City changing rooms, because that's another significant part of me. I'm 3rd generation Manchester City. The reason why I share those things is that that's part of my belief about people should bring their whole selves to work, and that's one of the things that I bring into my approach when I'm working with various different clients, and encouraging them to do the same to help with relationships and understanding of each other.
Yeah, I'd go along with that, Phil. I think people should bring their whole selves to work. That probably shouldn't extend to those types of jumpers, though.
Possibly not. No.
I'm not going to make any excuses for that.
Or scarves, possibly.
So, how about a little bit more about you?
Yes. So, what's quite important, I find, in running my own consultancy is being very, very clear about who I am and how I operate. And my values are there on the left. Now, those have come to me over a period of time, and actually do describe the approach that I take and what people have said about working with me. If I just choose the second one there, the evidence-based, I've seen several consultants before who will look for just things to support maybe what a chief exec or MD has told them, and won't necessarily be that objective. But I'm particularly keen to evidence what I've found in working with clients. One of the other values there is to be human, which might sound a little strange, but it's really one of my core beliefs, that understanding that everybody is different and there isn't a single mould, for example, for great leadership, and that people have different strengths and development areas, and it's in understanding the whole person that the most value can be found, rather than just one perceived weakness to the exclusion of all other points. And the final one is bespoke. What I'm not an advocate of is so-called best practice solutions that tend to just be the latest fad, and what you can often find just being pasted onto organisations, regardless of what their specific needs are, or how well that is going to fit. So I look to really understand clients and bring a bespoke approach to diagnostics and to solutions as well. I've included as well on that slide my profile, the team management profile, for a number of reasons, in that I keep going back to that. It keeps reminding me about my preference areas and my strengths, and it doesn't take too much to see that I'm a creator innovator, but also that my wheel is quite balanced. I know I have to work harder at that concluder producer elements. The other scores are on the top right hand side as well. So I'm a slight introvert. What that means for me in practice is that whilst I'll stay in the moment with a client and be really interested in them and taking the brief, I know there's a great advantage for me in going away and reflecting on that and coming back with proposals and solutions rather than trying to solve it in the moment. The other point is about that structure and flexibility that I think actually works quite well, in that I will bring the structure to a client, but I'll also be flexible and mould whatever I'm talking about, or the solutions that I'm bringing to their specific needs. And all of that ties in with that bespoke value as well.
Just before we move on, Phil, are there any aspects of that, your preferences there, that you feel your clients draw upon most?
It's a good question, Mark. I think the advising is quite important, and in working with all the clients that I work best with, perhaps, are those that are quite creative, are looking for some sort of innovative solution that is specific to their particular needs. It can be a bit more difficult where people already have preconceived ideas of what they want, and then I feel that that's it's less of an engaging process. You're just providing perhaps just a tool rather than bringing all the insights that I can bring about what their particular needs are and what might work best for them.
I really like this as a practical the takeaway for the consultants and practitioners we've got on the line, just to think about, have you ever considered bringing your profile to the table and saying, this is what I'm bringing as part of me and my approach to the consultant, and this is what makes my approach different. Really, really like that. Shall we move on to take a look at the team itself?
Yeah. Well, shortly before we do that, Mark, actually this is the profile of the managing director of the business that we're talking about, and he was new to the business, and he engaged me to help him with a different perspective on his leadership team and the culture in the business. So the first things that you notice is that he's got those explorer, promoter, major role preferences, but also that creative streak, that innovation streak. So there's lots of synergies, lots of easy conversations, lots of enthusiasm and creativity when he and I are actually engaged in dialogue. So that works really well in terms of making a connection. Some of the things that are a bit more challenging are his enthusiasm and extroversion compared to my slight introversion. So we understand that about each other, and we know that what each other needs in terms of a space to reflect, particularly. What I also need to do is make sure that what we said we will do will actually get delivered, because when you see the 8% in producing for me and 6% for this particular MD, that has to be a focus area. So it can't all be good ideas and enthusiasm at the start that actually isn't delivered. And the flexibility is quite a good point and interesting as well, in that we will look in the moment and actually see what is working and what needs to change, and we're both comfortable with that as well. So it works really, really well. Obviously, in taking the brief as well, there are the other obvious things that you need to cover, not least timescales and budget, because all of this has to work for your client.
So, should we move to talk about how you approach the whole approach of designing some type of intervention and an initiative there?
Yeah.
Yeah, from this. So, and was this stage one? Was this you about getting to know your client and the person who was sponsoring you then?
This particular thing was, yes. And then once we've done that, we're moving on to look at the rest of the senior team, which involved 26 people. So, having had the initial meeting with the client and taken away the brief, I then spent quite some time thinking, how am I actually going to make a diagnostic work? So what I came up with is reflected in this model. So I decided to use the team management profile because that has all the advantages of helping people understand their work style and preferences, along with how to better interact with other people, what their particular leadership strengths may be, and how they would look working in a team, and includes that lovely written report with all the different points for people to consider. Now, I decided to use the team management profile because of its robustness, because of its track record, and because that would give great credibility in the results of the diagnostic that I would be then presenting back. It's also a really nice way when you're sitting down with individuals who perhaps might be a bit unsure of what your purpose is, of generating some two-way discussion. So, and for them to have something to take away, as I was mentioning earlier. So, team management profile works really, really well, and it's a nice introduction to the rest of the discussion with each individual. So, as I was mentioning earlier, there were 26 people involved, from the MD to the board of directors and the senior management team, spending 2 hours with each person. So on my diagram there, it says interview. I didn't call it an interview, but for the purposes of this, it was just a discussion with them, which I created a structure around, allowing them to pretty much talk around the subjects that we needed to cover. So along with the self-introduction, and we talked about leadership. So I was asking each individual what they understood leadership to be, how they were demonstrating those behaviours, and what help, support, development that they had had. And in a very similar way, we talked about their management style and approach as well. In structuring this whole conversation, I knew that the things that were perhaps more difficult to talk about, I needed to cover later, about organisational culture. So it was very conscious for me to lead with the team management profile, which is hard copy and tangible, and you can talk about, and you can get the wheel out on the table and use all of those tools, and then start in a structured way to talk about things that they might expect, like themselves and leadership. When we're getting into things like organisational culture, communications, cross-functional working, I needed people to already be in the flow of the conversation to talk openly about that. So that is why I structured it in that sequence. What was important as well in conducting the conversation or interview was for me to capture their words. So at that particular point, I was not forming any views or judgments or characterising anybody in any way. I was capturing what they said because, again, linking in with my need to go away and reflect, I wanted to take those views later but capture the evidence, which is one of the values.
So just going back to the title of the session, we're talking about a team in crisis. At this stage, did they see themselves as a team in crisis?
I don't think they probably did. I think they probably thought that times were difficult and hard and everybody was trying their best. And because they were so operationally focused on the crises, they weren't reflecting on where they or their teams or the organisation itself were actually at. So bringing in this fresh perspective was vital to them, and when we get to the results point, giving them some time to pause and reflect and to actually hold the mirror up and say, we think it looks like this, was really an important activity because they weren't giving themselves any of that time to pause and reflect. The final part of the diagnostic was me really bringing my skills and experience from a long career in HR to understand what was going on with the person in the moment. So how they were conducting themselves, how they were interacting with me, the language they were using, all those aspects that shows their emotional intelligence, their identity, and perhaps even their attitude. And somewhere with those three different sources of evidence comes some sort of truth in the middle about this is where the person is at and this is what they think of how the business is doing.
So you were trying to get to the truth.
Absolutely.
Of this team.
Yeah.
What did you find?
Well, we've come on to the next slide. So there's a lot of information on there, but perhaps if I explain that I reported at various different levels. So I reported on the individual, on their functional team, on the leadership team or exec, and then the organisation as a whole. My diagnostic, I took a relatively simple visual approach along the lines of technical competence, experience, qualifications, training in leadership or management, and the leadership or people management behaviours. So just as a quick view at that, there was lots of technical competence. So unsurprisingly, there were people in roles who had been promoted once, twice, 3 times because they were good technically at their job. Where they had not perhaps been supported is in developing them as managers or leaders, and that's what's really showing on those red and amber bars across that chart. In terms of the culture and values, as I was mentioning earlier, it was really important for me to get people speaking and then to capture their words. So when I asked them about culture, my question was very simple and said, what's the culture like around here? And allowing them to populate that in whatever way they wanted to do, I felt was really, really important, rather than trying to structure it too much at this point. So some of the quotes were, a lot of people are still negative. We are quick to jump on people. Sometimes you'll find a hand in front of your face going, that's how it's always been. If it's not broke, we won't change it. And people always looking for the pitfalls and the downside. And people perhaps keeping their head below the parapet because of what happened to some of their colleagues in the past. In terms of the values, that was really interesting. Whilst I was conducting this process with each individual, I was sat in front of a huge values poster of the organisation, and again I asked them a simple question, what do you think about the values? And people said, don't really know what they are, even though they were right behind me. So clearly they're not embedded in the organisation, and people often in that moment talked about their own personal values.
Can I jump in with a devil's advocate question, Phil?
Yeah.
So I guess the approach you took here with the reporting and actually showing the team, revealing the team to the team what you discovered about them through your interviews and your observations, and with the profile, the green, amber, red system was very much your kind of interpretation.
Yes.
Was there any pushback around that it was your interpretation as opposed to somebody else's or their own interpretation? How did they receive this?
Yeah, there wasn't actually, which slightly concerned me, because when you have sort of nodding acceptance in the room, you wonder whether people are really bought in. At the same time as well, if they hadn't been taught about leadership or management, then they're not necessarily going to know what good looks like either. So whilst I was sharing these findings with what I called insight workshops with people and playing back their own words to them, there wasn't that pushback. But what there was that moment of pause for reflection and almost disappointment in the room. One of the directors, I remember saying when I put some of the quotes up on culture and asking what do people think, he just said, it makes me really depressed that we know this is what it's like and we're not doing anything about it yet, I have to say.
Yeah, what a beautiful gem of an opening for a consultant as well, for that to be the benchmark that you can work from. They know. Absolutely.
And just linking a little bit back to my values as well, where I'm evidence-based. So I was fully prepared to stand by each one of those conclusions or judgments and say, well, I think this because other people might have a different interpretation, and that's absolutely fine, but you've asked me to come in, so this is my view. In the same breath, I was also saying to them in showing that red, amber, green chart, I realise that this is unfair because I'm judging you and nobody's helped you. But we are going to look at how we work together and how we provide that help and support and development to you.
Great. So a lot of information there for them to digest, and for you to have consolidated. Was there anything else that you shared with them at this stage?
Yeah, everybody has done an individual team management profile. So they'd had their individual results and conversations with me, but it was important also to reflect to them about how it looked at an organisational level, which is what we're going to look at next. So
we produced this, used the dynamic team mapping that you said to produce this. So I think maybe before you jump in and sort of share about what happened here at this stage, Phil, we've got a lot of accredited practitioners on the line with us. So have a look at those visuals. So just so that we're clear here, so we're looking at the business as a whole, or this is everyone that you worked with?
It's the people that I work with. There's 26 people.
There's 26 individuals who have the one-to-ones on this on the executive talent program. What are you seeing here? Into your chat boxes, what's jumping out for you here? Just to remind you any of your teams that you're currently working with or have worked with. And to what extent does this help add additional context to what we've already heard about this team? I guess while we're waiting for some comments here, so I'll jump in with some of mine, things that are jumping out for me. Well, the one that's kind of screaming at me is that third scale on the work preference measures, that every single individual in that team had some aspect of analytical preference for decision making, and not one person had any kind of belief-based preference. We know from our research that's not unusual to have a skew, but for every single person in that team to to be sort of leaning that way to some degree is quite unusual. And I wonder to what extent that came through in how you presented this to them, and also, you know, what they did with the information. While we wait for some more comments, we've got a question here from Wolfgang. Wolfgang said, how do you differentiate between leadership behaviour and people management behaviour?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Wolfgang. There's lots of theory about leadership and management and the differentiation. I'm not a particular fan of any leadership theory on its own, but my belief is that good leadership is about sharing a vision, role modelling the required behaviours that you want to see in your organisation. It has elements of growing capability below you, and that trust and empowerment, and communicating effectively across and down the organisation, and seeing that as a fundamental part of your role. People management to me is more transactional. It's about managing performance of teams and individuals, and that can be by objectives or other similar performance measures, and providing people with what they need to actually do their job. It's quite a simplistic view, and lots of theories are built around that, but that's how I'm differentiating it. And interestingly, the teams, the individuals that I'm working with, really understand the difference between leadership and management now. They have a particular phrase in the business that everybody was operating in the weeds. What they're meaning is everybody's down at ground level in the weeds and nobody's got any perspective. So everyone acting as operational managers, even when they've got layers of people below them, perhaps not allowing those people to do their jobs, not developing them, going and fixing things themselves because they've got the technical expertise, because that's their background, rather than getting out of that and having some perspective. And that perhaps shows in the team management wheel as well.
Thanks, Phil. We've got a number of comments here. We'll try and get through all of them. Thank you guys for sending these in. This is great. So we have one here from Lisa Marie. Actually, two comments from Lisa Marie. The first one is the maintaining part being so low. Maybe this is also not helping with the culture pillars and maintenance, maintaining the culture piece.
Absolutely. So what I didn't mention early on is this organisation is part of a larger group. So there have been several initiatives in the past, but none of them have stuck. And I think that's shown in the maintaining part, that everybody's rushing to action in the weeds and then thinking, well, we've done that now. So perhaps the people who put the values posters on the walls thought, we've done that now. But they really hadn't, because the behaviours that support those values and the culture, as you're mentioning, just were not talked about. They were not part of the conversation. People were not relating them to how they behaved.
So another comment from Lisa Marie, this general profile also tends to suggest that this team might get bored after launching the projects, low on inspecting and feeding this back to the advising ineffective part, which is low also.
Yeah, that's a great observation. One of the, and I'll talk about how we took things further forward with the development program for them. But one of my absolute focuses is making sure that they commit and that they honour their commitments and the actions that come out of those stick. So I'm very conscious of that in working with them.
We've got a couple of comments here from Liz. Liz says she also noticed that interesting that no one seems to have a decision-making preference on the beliefs side of that scale. I've never come across this before. Liz also says this is a team profile I have seen before. I think she's talking about the sort of wider picture there. Sure. Very action and doing oriented, and probably not into reviewing and reflecting on their actions enough. Not untypical. Yeah,
I 100% agree with that. Lots of rush to action, lots of trying to fix things in quite a knee-jerk way, and not really stepping back and thinking, why are these issues continually occurring, you know, and how do we change and improve the business? It's an operational focus over a change orientation focus.
So yeah, this is a great one from Susan. Susan's noticed the overall team map is quite different to the MD's preferences.
It's a great observation, yeah. And we've had conversations along those lines in terms of the leadership he's providing for that team and their particular preferences for structure and conclusion relative to his are quite different. We're going to do some work later in the year about the different strengths and how those work to complement each other, along with also, without making it too complicated, helping people to grow to become more all-rounded leaders so that they move more towards his type of preferences, perhaps somewhere in the middle of the team map or wheel.
Excellent. We've got time for one more, I think, and then we'll move on. It's from Rhodey. Rhodey said, what stands out for me is the uniformity of the team's preferences.
Yeah. Yeah.
And just a comment back here from Wolfgang, who said, thanks for your explanation between people management and leadership.
Absolute pleasure. Yes, this is really one of the challenges. So when the MD brought me in, he recognised that his preferences were different to pretty much the majority of his team, and their perspectives were all the same. So they thought things were sort of okay, or even when they didn't think they were okay, it wasn't going to drive any difference in their behaviours. So he needed this perspective from me, but it also showing visually. So we did some exercise, which we'll show shortly. We've got a photograph showing the people clustered physically around one part of the wheel and the gap in the other areas.
Thanks, Phil. Okay, so was there anything else you wanted to add about your experience of this team's preferences after having worked with them that we haven't already covered?
Yeah, I think just on the top scale there, about the extrovert and the introvert, lots of sort of outgoing personalities, lots of people who will be very sort of quite big in the room, and a few people who need a bit quieter and need more of that reflection space. The work that I was doing with them was actually getting them to slow and stop and pause and think, which is much more of a challenge with the people on the extroversion scale, particularly when they're quite far towards the left-hand side.
Brilliant, thank you. So where should we go next?
Okay, so we worked with the team, we shared the results and the insights and offered to help, and they bought into that help. So we've designed an executive talent program. There's quite a lot of information on there, so I apologise for that for a start. So the design of this program, unlike others that I've seen or been part of personally, came directly from the evidence that had already been shared with the people. So they bought in and knew that they needed help on leadership styles and behaviours. What I was also very keen to put in there in the initial modules was some input on health and well-being and mindfulness or resilience. They didn't particularly recognise that as a need, but I knew that in the crisis that the business was in, and in trying to grow them as leaders, they would need those insights and various tools that we gave them through that. So this is why I prioritise leadership behaviours, awareness, and health and well-being. The other thing to point out is the yellow sections as well, because you'll often see on executive programs that there's lots of training. People go in the classrooms and they do training. The yellow areas were to emphasise the need for follow-ups and support, diarised with each individual, which would provide almost a milestone for checking the commitments that they'd made on at the end of each module and their progress against them. It's a really important thing for me to help to lock in progress and learning and to maintain momentum in the programme. The other thing I wanted to point out on this is you've got to know when you need to go get help. So the green sections are being delivered by other people and I'm delivering on the blue sections. I think that provides expertise for individuals, but also a different voice in the room. I think that's an important thing to do. The final thing that I wanted to emphasise about this programme is we will probably flex the modules later on. Now that plays to the MD's preference, and I can work with that. You've seen that from my profile as well. But also as more information comes to light through these activities and through interactions in the business, it becomes clear which things need more emphasis and which are perhaps less of a priority. So right now, as we're speaking, we know we've got to do more on relationships and communication skills, and we're finding a way to put an extra day in and maybe vary one of the later days or drop that off. A bit unusual for an exec programme where you normally view it as being fixed in stone, but perhaps is more reflective of real life and real needs.
How's that been? Just thinking back to, I can see that mirrors your approach and it mirrors the MD's approach. Thinking back to the team themselves, quite a lot of them had quite a strong structured preference.
Yeah.
And so if you're building flex in, how does that resolve itself?
We need to communicate extremely well and help them with that lack of structure and flex. But I would argue that would help them to become more rounded leaders anyway.
Thank you. And you said you had some things to share around what's been going on so far and what's been happening so far. Should we take a look at some photos?
Yeah. Yeah, photos are good. So top left, you see people clustered around one particular area of the profile, the team management wheel. Also, I tried to capture in the photos that I'm sharing the space that I've created for people during the sessions to have dialogue, to reflect, and to develop their own insights. Interestingly, the strange object that you can see having been built in the bottom left is a trolley for the back of a bicycle. That was a session that was run by Gary Cookson for me. And despite having spent several days talking about leadership and behaviours and need for perspective, what actually happened in the exercise is everybody dived into the detail and got on with the task and messed it up, frankly. So that served as a useful reminder about the behaviours that were needed, but it also served as a bit of a shock in that we've still got work to do on this.
Just a couple of comments here, Phil. If we just go back, a couple of people have just mentioned what's in the purple boxes, because they weren't coming through clearly on that particular screen.
Yeah.
So in the purple boxes we have professional development.
Yes. So I've been emphasising to each person that they need to take ownership of their professional development. So some of them may be engineers or quantity surveyors or finance people. And particularly where a business is going through difficulties or challenges, it can easily drop off. I'm passionate about people continuing to develop professionally. When that falls off your radar, your knowledge gets more and more out of date, and you will find things much more difficult. So yeah, that's why those are there.
And just another comment here from Lisa Marie. Well, earlier on, Rhodey was talking about the fact that this team's quite uniform in terms of preferences. Lisa Marie pointed out, interestingly, gender-wise,
yeah,
also relatively uniform.
Yeah.
This particular group.
Out of the group of 26 people, there were 2 women. Not much I can do about those are the people that were presented to me. And perhaps is reflective of engineering businesses generally, unfortunately.
Yeah.
what has been interesting is that, not necessarily on a gender basis, but in terms of difference within the room, the different types of conversations I've been having with people. So another exercise that I did, which I should have put a photo on, was getting people to map relationships using Lego characters and where they sat relative to each other. So that was fascinating, about people who see themselves as being a bit more distant. But my conversation with them was encouraging them to stay in the room because they have a contribution to make, and sameness is not really a good thing. Difference and different skills and the value that brings is better.
It's funny you should mention that. I was listening to a podcast on the way in this morning, and they were talking about that in nature, where you've got the merging of two different ecosystems. That is where you get the
innovations, change.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Innovation, new species start to spring up. Yeah. And so true is the case here, when you bring together different groups of people from different perspectives, whether it's cognitive, gender, age, neurodiversity, that's when you're on that, bridging those gaps is where you get the gold.
Yeah, yeah. And I've mentioned about my career before, I've seen initiatives, well-meaning ones introduced, which more or less push people into boxes and say everybody needs to be like this. Well, everybody isn't like that. Everybody might have some of those elements, but the differences and the value that brings is actually advantageous to businesses.
Should we move on to talk about that in terms of your approach?
Yes.
So how have you approached all of this, Phil?
Okay. So in terms of my style, and you'll probably get this from how I've been speaking and from the values that I've talked about before, everything that I do is aligned to my values, and sometimes that is more difficult with some clients than others, but I will always do that and bring that truth, really, that honesty, that authenticity to the work that I do. And we need to take account of individuals and flex our approach. Telling everybody to be the same, as we were just mentioning, is just foolish, really. I don't know anybody who's the same as anybody else. Inclusivity is quite important, and bringing people into the room and getting them really engaged with findings and getting them to take ownership of that is absolutely vital. Yeah, you probably get that I'm quite honest and straightforward, and I'm prepared to stand by my findings, but also when new information comes to light, to flex those, because trying to think that you know everything in a moment is just foolish, really. And I'll bring ideas, I'll bring that creativity that you saw on my profile, but also I know that structure and substance is important, even if it's slightly more difficult for me to do that. And we talked about bespoke solutions. I really don't believe in pasting on so-called best practice. I mean, that's a version of just copying somebody else's homework, isn't it? And yeah, I don't know everything, don't think I ever will, and I will go and get help and support and expertise. And yeah, I had an interesting conversation yesterday with one of the directors in this business, and we were talking about getting into a coaching type agreement. We needed to talk about our relationship and trust. And he said, initially when he came in, people were perhaps fearful, wondering whether you were assessing and whether people would be exited. And it's only over the period of time of how I've operated, how I've been true to my values, what I've delivered, that has built credibility and trust. And he said some really nice words to me, which I won't embarrass myself by sharing, but I think being true to yourself and delivering is important.
How very British of you, Phil. Oh, of course. Yeah. And I guess we started this by talking about the story, didn't we? The story of this leadership, and what we're seeing here is this is the story so far. This is the story so far. Perhaps you'll come back and tell us a little bit more another time about what you've been what has progressed, since some of these other stages of the program we've rolled out. But in terms of where you are now, what have you learned so far? What have been some of the key learnings?
Yeah, evidence is so important, and we all gather evidence all the time, whether we're using a credible psychometric tool like the TMSDI's team management profile, or our own observations or people's words. That's evidence, and it cuts through being blown around in the breeze of fads and just jumping on the latest good thing. Sometimes as well, the client's preferences and their needs, you've got to balance that. That it can be a bit of a dichotomy. Inclusion involvement is vital, as we said earlier, and being prepared to flex is really important, and getting help and support. And sort of final point for me as well, as I alluded to earlier, is I'm learning all the time. I don't have fixed ideas or favourite tools or pet theories that I'm going to use all the time. I'm going to use my experience and my judgment to find things that work for different clients, and I think having those fixed ideas is probably a really bad thing for you and for your clients as well.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing those. And thank you in general for telling us the story so far. We have got some space at this part of the webinar to look at any particular questions, comments, reflections from the group. So as over the next few minutes, if you want to type those into the chat box. As people are doing that, Phil, where can people find out more about what you do?
Yeah, so I have my contact details, various different channels. Everybody's got the different preferences, haven't they? So I'm on LinkedIn, just as Phil Marsland. You can see my website address there and email. Also quite active on Twitter. I've got a couple of identities on there, one a bit more long-standing than the other. I'd love to hear from you with any questions or anything further that you may need.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Phil. So, well, I've got a few comments coming in. Please, by all means, this is your space to ask them. If we don't get around to answering all of them, please just let us know, and we can make sure we try and handle that offline. As people are typing in, a couple of announcements from the TMSDI team. We've got lots going on over the next few weeks, including this Friday we've got two webinars. One of them is for people who are totally new to the team management profile. It's called the Discovery Webinar. And then we also have a Discovery Webinar for people who wanted to find out a little bit more about our latest profile, which is the Leadership Behaviours Profile, a 360. A bit more on that in a second, but 3 p.m. on Friday we'll be running a Discovery Webinar all about leadership behaviours, picking up on a few of the themes actually that we've covered today. If you've got colleagues or yourself are interested in getting accredited to use a team management profile, we've got a webinar that's taking place next week. You can get accredited by attending both of those sessions. And equally, we have another event taking place in our beautiful city of York in a few weeks' time on the 8th of August. Just find out more about that by heading over to tmsdi.com. And then, of course, yes, we've talked a lot about leadership in this particular session, and we do have a key leadership offering, which is our Leadership Behaviours Profile. It's an in-depth 360, which explores a whole range of different factors. And as Phil said, it doesn't use one particular theory, but fuses together a whole range of contemporary leadership approaches in a really rich 360 report, including emotional intelligence and a fantastic follow-up, which is called the Pulse Report. Okay, we'll get to these questions in just a second. This is a word from our wonderful marketing team, just not to forget, if you want to hear about sessions like this, which are designed to help you extend your practice and sort of broaden perspectives as accredited practitioners of our network, don't forget to let us know how you'd like to be contacted. We have a preference centre set up on our website. All you need to do is type in the addresses on the screen, bit.ly/TMSDI-PC, and if you just answer a couple of questions on the screen, we'll make sure you get exactly the sort of information that you'd like. Okie dokie, so a couple of comments here. So from Rhodey, thank you so much, both of you. A really good story about the importance of self-awareness before we try to help others.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rosie. And then said, incredible, insightful webinar. Thanks, Phil and Mark. Lenny's said, thank you, I really enjoyed the presentation. Oh, we have a question here from Elke over in Switzerland. So Elke said, what did the team report back and what have been their key takeaways so far?
That's a great question, thank you. Some of the feedback has been about the positive impact that this has made on the team, that they're working more closely together, and that as various fresh crises come along, they're handling them in a much better way, and that perhaps they, in the past, they would have just passed that on or thrown it over the garden wall to their next department, and they're not doing that anymore. They're working much more cohesively as a leadership team.
Thank you, Phil. Right, all that remains is for me to say a huge thank you once again for sharing your story, sharing all that is to be a consultant, running your own business, and taking a true consultancy approach to what we're seeing is a relatively common problem with these types of teams. I hope that for those of you who joined, you had some useful takeaways, useful insights, and maybe some different things to think about when you're approaching the teams that you work with.
Okay, thank you, Mark. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, everybody. I hope there's some insights. I hope it makes a difference for you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Phil. Thanks to everyone for joining, and we look forward to hearing from you soon. Take care.